Forget the somber documentaries and Ken Burns' narration. World War I wasn't just the war to end all wars. It was 4 years of humanity collectively losing its mind while simultaneously proving that military intelligence is sometimes an oxymoron. We're talking about decisions so spectacularly stupid that they make modern reality TV look like a Mensa convention. Welcome to the video where we pull back the curtain on the historical disasters your textbooks conveniently forgot to mention. Get ready for 31 reasons to ask, wait, these were supposed to be the smart people in charge? Let's dive into the madness. 1. Let's kick this off with France's answer to modern warfare, bright red pants. Yes, you read that right. As Europe entered the 20th century with machine guns and long-range rifles, the French army marched into battle wearing brilliant crimson trousers called pantalon rouge, paired with dark blue coats. Military leadership genuinely believed that maintaining this Napoleonic-era uniform was essential for French military spirit and morale. When generals suggested switching to less visible khaki or gray, they were told, "Le pantalon rouge c'est la France." The red pants are France. Apparently, being easily spotted from 800 yards away was considered a point of national pride. French soldiers were literally walking bullseyes, and casualties in the opening months of the war were catastrophic. It took tens of thousands of deaths before someone finally convinced high command that maybe, just maybe, stealth was more valuable than style. Fashion over function at its absolute deadliest. 2. Britain decided to solve trench warfare with giant metal death boxes on tracks, and the first tanks were engineering nightmares. The Mark I tank, introduced in 1916, was a claustrophobic steel coffin that reached a blistering top speed of 3.7 miles per hour on flat ground, slower than a casual walk. Inside, the temperature regularly hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The engine fumes were so toxic that crews frequently passed out. There was no suspension, so every bump and shell crater felt like being inside a violently shaking trash can. The steering required 4 men coordinating movements, and it often just didn't work. Tanks regularly got stuck in mud, broke down, or simply stopped moving for mysterious mechanical reasons. The crew of 8 was crammed into a space filled with scalding hot engine parts, ammunition that could cook off, and fuel tanks waiting to explode. Oh, and the only ventilation came from holes that also let in bullets and shrapnel. Early tank crews had a life expectancy measured in minutes once combat started. 3. Austria-Hungary's military spoke 11 different languages, and nobody thought this would be a problem. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a patchwork of ethnicities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, and Italians, all drafted into the same army. Officers typically spoke German or Hungarian and barked orders expecting everyone to understand. They didn't. Critical commands in battle were lost in translation. Soldiers couldn't communicate with their own squad members. Emergency warnings went unheeded because nobody understood them. The military tried to solve this with a system of 80 standardized words of command that everyone was supposed to memorize in German. In the chaos of actual combat, with artillery exploding and machine guns firing, trying to remember your memorized German vocabulary list was about as effective as it sounds. Units frequently fired on their own allies because they couldn't identify themselves verbally. It was the world's deadliest game of telephone, and everyone lost. 4. Italy decided the best way to fight Austria-Hungary was to repeatedly charge up the same mountain. The battles of the Isonzo weren't one battle, they were 12 separate battles fought over the same river valley between 1915 and 1917. Italian General Luigi Cadorna had one strategy: throw more soldiers at the heavily fortified Austrian positions in the Alps and hope something changes. Spoiler alert, nothing changed. Each battle followed the same script. Italian troops would advance uphill through barbed wire and machine gun fire, suffer massive casualties, gain maybe a few hundred yards of worthless rocky terrain, then get pushed back. Then Cadorna would say, "Okay, but what if we try again?" The definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting different results. By that standard, Cadorna was certifiably nuts. Over 300,000 Italians died fighting over the Isonzo, and when the Austrians and Germans finally decided to attack in the 12th battle, they broke through Italian lines in hours, proving that maybe, just maybe, there were better tactics available the whole time. 5. The Germans thought Zeppelins were the future of strategic bombing. These massive hydrogen-filled airships could carry bombs over England, striking fear into civilian hearts. They were also slow, enormous, highly visible targets filled with literally the most flammable gas in existence. British pilots quickly figured out that shooting incendiary rounds into a Zeppelin turned it into a massive floating fireball. The hydrogen would ignite, and the entire airship would be consumed in seconds, with the crew having no chance of survival. The first time a Zeppelin was shot down over London, crowds gathered in the streets to watch it burn and cheer. Despite the horrifying death toll on their crews, Germany kept sending them. Zeppelin raids killed about 500 British civilians over the entire war while losing dozens of airships and trained crews. The cost-benefit analysis here is staggering. They could have achieved more damage by literally mailing bombs via postal service, and it would have been safer for everyone involved. 6. Trench foot was entirely preventable, yet it disabled hundreds of thousands of soldiers. This grotesque condition happened when soldiers stood in cold, wet trenches for days or weeks without changing their socks or boots. Their feet would swell, turn numb, then develop gangrene. In severe cases, toes or entire feet would need amputation. The cure? Change your socks regularly and keep your feet dry. That's it. That was the whole solution. Yet military leadership initially treated it as a discipline problem rather than a medical issue. Soldiers were court-martialed for self-inflicted wounds when they got trench foot, as if they deliberately gave themselves gangrene to avoid fighting. It took years before armies mandated regular sock changes and foot inspections. The British Army alone reported over 74,000 trench foot casualties in the winter of 1914 to 1915. Imagine losing 74,000 men not to bullets or shells, but to wet socks. That's not war, that's a catastrophic failure of basic hygiene policy. 7. Carrier pigeons were genuinely one of the most reliable communication methods, which tells you everything about how bad military communications actually were. Radio technology existed but was heavy, unreliable, and easily intercepted. Telephone wires got cut by artillery constantly. So armies turned to birds. Thousands of pigeons were trained and deployed carrying tiny messages in capsules on their legs. The success rate was actually impressive, around 95%. But there were some absolutely absurd problems. Pigeons could only fly home, not to new locations, so armies had to constantly transport them to the front lines, then send them back. Hawks and Falcons quickly figured out that these pigeons were targets, and the Germans actually deployed Hawks to hunt Allied messenger pigeons. Yes, World War I featured aerial combat between birds. The most famous pigeon, Cher Ami, saved 194 soldiers but arrived with one leg hanging by a tendon and a bullet through its chest. The fact that a half-dead pigeon was more reliable than military technology really says it all. 8. The British Army initially refused to issue steel helmets because they thought it would make soldiers look cowardly. From 1914 to 1915, British troops went into battle wearing soft cloth caps that offered zero protection against shrapnel, the leading cause of head injuries. French and German soldiers already had metal helmets, but British command worried that protective headgear would damage morale and make their men appear less brave. They genuinely believed that a stiff upper lip was better defense than steel. It took a doctor analyzing casualty statistics to prove that, shockingly, metal helmets prevented lethal head wounds. When the Brodie helmet was finally issued in 1916, head wound fatalities dropped by 80%. That means thousands of British soldiers died from preventable head injuries because their leadership prized the aesthetic of courage over actual survival. Looking tough versus staying alive shouldn't have been a debate, yet here we were. 9. Russia sent soldiers into battle without rifles. The Russian Empire's mobilization was so vast and chaotic that they literally ran out of weapons. Units were deployed to the front with the expectation that they would pick up rifles from dead soldiers. Not as a backup plan, as the actual plan. Commanders would tell fresh troops, wait until the first wave gets killed, then grab their guns and charge. This wasn't a temporary shortage, it lasted for years. Approximately one-third of Russian forces at any given time had no personal weapon. The human cost of this staggering incompetence was catastrophic. Soldiers were sent to die knowing they couldn't even defend themselves. When the Bolsheviks criticized the Tsarist regime for treating soldiers as disposable, this was Exhibit A. You can't win a modern war when your strategy is, wait for your friends to die first, then it's your turn. The fact that Russia stayed in the war for 3 years under these conditions is less a testament to bravery and more to the absolute failure of leadership at every level. 10. Tunneling companies dug miles of tunnels under enemy trenches to plant massive mines. Both sides did this, which meant soldiers were also terrified of the ground beneath them exploding without warning. The Battle of Messines in 1917 saw the British detonate 19 mines simultaneously under German positions. The explosion was so massive it was heard in London, 140 miles away, and killed an estimated 10,000 German soldiers instantly. But here's the absurd part, sometimes tunneling crews from opposing sides would accidentally tunnel into each other underground, leading to horrific close-quarters combat with pistols, knives, and pickaxes in pitch-black confined spaces hundreds of feet below the surface. There are stories of these underground fights lasting hours, with neither side able to retreat because the tunnels were too narrow. It was claustrophobic nightmare fuel that nobody above ground even knew was happening. Trench warfare was bad enough, but somehow humans found a way to make it worse by adding literal underground combat in the dark. 11. Soldiers discovered that if you held a match or cigarette lighter above the trench at night, enemy snipers would use it as a target. This led to the superstition that lighting 3 cigarettes from one match was bad luck. The logic: the first light gets the sniper's attention, the second lets them aim, and the third gets you killed. This wasn't actually based on real sniper behavior, it was mostly paranoia and coincidence. But it became such an ingrained belief that soldiers would refuse to be the third person to light up, and matches were deliberately designed to burn out faster. The match companies actually hated this superstition because it hurt sales. Meanwhile, soldiers were literally advertising their positions to snipers every night by lighting cigarettes, and the lesson they took away was, don't be number 3. Not, maybe don't create visible flame in a war zone, just, don't be third. The human brain's ability to create elaborate rituals around random chance while ignoring obvious danger is genuinely impressive. 12. Poison gas was first used by Germany at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, and it was simultaneously terrifying and wildly impractical. The Germans released 168 tons of chlorine gas from cylinders, creating a greenish-yellow cloud that drifted toward Allied trenches. It killed and injured thousands. But the delivery method was completely dependent on wind direction, which meant it could blow back on your own troops if the wind changed. This happened repeatedly. German soldiers were injured by their own gas attacks because meteorology in 1915 was not an exact science. Both sides eventually developed gas masks, which reduced effectiveness. Then they developed more lethal gases like phosgene and mustard gas. This created an arms race of chemical horror that ultimately achieved very little strategic value. Gas caused about 90,000 deaths during the entire war, which sounds like a lot until you realize that's less than 1% of total military deaths. It was a weapon of terror that scared everyone, disabled tens of thousands, created permanent long-term health problems, but didn't actually change the outcome of battles in any meaningful way. Maximum horror, minimum effectiveness. 13. The French military had a strategy called attaque à outrance, which translates to attack to excess. This wasn't just aggressive tactics, it was a philosophical belief that French soldiers possessed an inherent offensive spirit that could overcome machine guns, artillery, and fortifications through sheer willpower and aggressive bayonet charges. This doctrine was written into French military training before the war. Commanders genuinely taught that morale and aggressive spirit were more important than cover, suppressing fire, or any defensive preparation whatsoever. When the war started, French forces repeatedly charged directly into German machine gun positions with predictable results. In the first month alone, France suffered 300,000 casualties, including 75,000 dead. That's more than American deaths in the entire Vietnam War, in 1 month. The offensive spirit doctrine was eventually abandoned, but not before it killed or wounded nearly 1 million French soldiers in 1914. Believing you can manifest victory through positive thinking is fine for self-help books, not so much for industrial warfare. 14. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was initially treated as cowardice. Soldiers who broke down psychologically from the constant artillery bombardment, the gore, the stress, and the impossible conditions were often accused of faking illness to avoid combat. The British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers for cowardice or desertion, many of whom were clearly suffering from severe psychological trauma. Punishments for shell shock included being tied to posts in exposed positions, forced back into combat immediately, or court-martial. Medical officers who tried to advocate for these soldiers were ignored or reprimanded. It wasn't until late in the war that anyone began to recognize this as a legitimate medical condition rather than a character flaw. One officer described a soldier who couldn't stop shaking, couldn't speak, and broke into tears at sudden noises. The prescribed treatment? Send him back to the front immediately. The cruelty of this approach is staggering, treating traumatized men as criminals while demanding they continue experiencing the trauma that broke them. 15. Cavalry charges against machine guns happened repeatedly, despite being obviously suicidal. Military tradition across Europe held that cavalry were elite shock troops. Officers from aristocratic backgrounds had trained their entire lives for mounted warfare. The idea that horses were obsolete was unthinkable, even as every charge ended in slaughter. At the Battle of the Somme, British cavalry waited behind the lines for a breakthrough that never came, while machine guns mowed down infantry by the thousands. The Germans attempted cavalry charges on the Eastern Front and were decimated. In one particularly absurd incident, French cavalry charged German positions in 1914 in full Napoleonic-era regalia, with cuirasses and plumed helmets, and were annihilated by rifle and machine gun fire within minutes. The mounted soldier with a lance or saber stood no chance against a gunner firing 600 rounds per minute from an entrenched position. Yet cavalry units remained a significant part of military planning throughout the war, eating resources and accomplishing almost nothing except filling military cemeteries with horses and riders. 16. The Zimmermann telegram was Germany's attempt at secret diplomacy that backfired spectacularly. German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann sent a coded telegram to Mexico proposing a military alliance. If the U.S. entered the war against Germany, Mexico should attack the U.S., and in exchange, Germany would help Mexico reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. This plan had several glaring problems. First, Mexico was in the middle of a revolution and had no functional army capable of invading the U.S. Second, the U.S. military was vastly superior. Third, Mexico had no reason to want a war with its northern neighbor. Most importantly, British intelligence intercepted and decoded the telegram, then gave it to the American press. The revelation of Germany trying to provoke a Mexican invasion was one of the key factors that turned American public opinion in favor of entering the war. Zimmermann somehow made it worse by publicly admitting the telegram was real when questioned. Germany's brilliant diplomatic strategy managed to accomplish the exact opposite of its intention, practically gift-wrapping American entry into the war. 17. Soldiers lived with rats. Not occasional rats, but millions of them, thriving in the trenches. The combination of corpses, food waste, and standing water created the perfect rat habitat. Trenches were infested with brown rats and black rats, some growing to the size of cats. They ate food supplies, chewed through equipment, and spread disease. Soldiers would wake up to find rats crawling over them in the night. The rats were so bold they would steal food from soldiers' hands. Attempts to control them with poison, traps, or shooting them had minimal effect because the reproduction rate was too high and the environment too perfect. Soldiers developed a special hatred for rats, and killing them became a grim pastime. Some units organized rat hunts with bets on who could kill the most. The psychological impact of being constantly surrounded by disease-carrying vermin while trying to survive a war added another layer of horror to trench life. The trenches weren't just a battlefield, they were a rat-infested apocalypse that soldiers had to somehow sleep and eat in. 18. Soldiers on both sides occasionally refused to fight during unofficial truces. The famous Christmas truce of 1914 saw British and German soldiers emerging from trenches to exchange gifts, play football, and bury their dead together. When High Command found out, they were furious. Officers who participated were reprimanded, and strict orders were issued forbidding any fraternization with the enemy. The problem was that soldiers on both sides realized they had more in common with each other than with their own leadership. Both groups were cold, miserable, eating terrible food, and being ordered to die for land measured in yards. This created a serious morale problem for commanders who needed men to hate each other enough to kill on command. In some sectors, unofficial live and let live arrangements developed where neither side would fire during meal times or at night, as long as the other side reciprocated. The High Command's response was to order constant aggressive patrolling and raids to prevent troops from getting too comfortable. The greatest threat to military operations apparently wasn't the enemy, it was your own soldiers deciding that maybe this whole war thing was stupid. 19. Artillery barrages before major offensives were supposed to destroy enemy defenses. Instead, they telegraphed exactly when and where attacks would happen. Commanders would order days-long bombardments, firing millions of shells to soften up enemy positions. The Germans would hear the barrage, know an attack was coming, and simply move reinforcements to that sector. They'd hide in deep bunkers during the shelling, then emerge when it stopped and set up machine guns to massacre the advancing infantry. At the Battle of the Somme, the British fired 1.7 million shells over 7 days. The Germans knew exactly what was coming. When British troops went over the top on July 1, 1916, German machine gunners were ready and waiting. The British suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, including 20,000 dead. The artillery that was supposed to protect them had instead served as a week-long alarm clock for the enemy. This pattern repeated throughout the war, yet commanders continued ordering preparatory bombardments, seemingly unable to grasp that surprise might be more valuable than blowing up empty trenches. 20. Soldiers had to deal with lice constantly. Not just a few lice, but infestation so severe that clothes would be visibly moving. The trenches provided perfect conditions for body lice to thrive, no way to wash clothes properly, soldiers packed together, and no pest control. Lice caused intense itching, sores, and spread diseases like trench fever. Soldiers would spend hours chatting, which was slang for killing lice by running candle flames along the seams of their uniforms where lice laid eggs. This would kill some of them, but they'd be back within days. Some units tried boiling clothes, but in the trenches, this was nearly impossible. The psychological toll of constant parasitic infestation while trying to survive combat added another layer of misery to daily life. Soldiers wrote letters home describing how they'd kill hundreds of lice only to be reinfested by the next morning. Chemical delousing stations were eventually set up behind the lines, but they couldn't keep up with the scale of infestation. The itching never stopped. The biting never stopped. For 4 years. 21. Flamethrowers were introduced as a terrifying new weapon, and they were absolute death traps for the operators. The German Flammenwerfer required soldiers to carry a heavy fuel tank on their back, connected to a handheld nozzle. The range was only about 60 feet maximum, which meant you had to get extremely close to enemy trenches. You were also carrying highly flammable fuel on your back while being shot at. If the tank was hit, you'd become a human fireball. Even if you weren't shot, using the flamethrower made you the #1 target for every enemy soldier in range. Operators were specifically targeted first because of how terrifying the weapon was. The average life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in combat was measured in minutes. Despite this, all sides used them throughout the war. The psychological impact on enemies was significant. Everyone was terrified of being burned alive. But from a practical standpoint, strapping on a flamethrower was basically volunteering to be target practice while wearing a bomb. The bravery required is undeniable, the intelligence of the tactic is highly questionable. 22. Military censorship reached absurd levels. Letters home were read by officers who would black out any information that might be useful to the enemy. This included obvious things like locations and battle plans, but also descended into ridiculous territory. Soldiers couldn't mention the weather because it might help enemy planning. They couldn't describe their mood too honestly because it might hurt morale. Some letters arrived home as mostly black ink with only, "I am well," visible. Soldiers developed elaborate codes to communicate real information. "Your aunt is visiting" might mean, "We're preparing for an offensive." "The garden needs work" could mean, "Conditions are terrible." Meanwhile, the same military that carefully censored letters was publishing detailed casualty lists in newspapers that told the Germans exactly which units had taken heavy losses and where they'd been fighting. The information security policy was, keep soldiers from telling their mothers about rain, but publish comprehensive casualty data in public newspapers. The contradiction was never addressed. 23. Soldiers were issued trench clubs for close-quarters combat, and they looked like medieval weapons made in someone's garage. These homemade weapons included simple wooden clubs embedded with nails, metal spikes, or barbed wire. Some were brass knuckles attached to handles. Others were sharpened shovels. The purpose was silent killing during trench raids when gunfire would alert the entire enemy line. The fact that World War I, fought with machine guns, artillery, and poison gas, also featured soldiers beating each other with nail-studded clubs in hand-to-hand combat really highlights the schizophrenic nature of the conflict. It was simultaneously the most technologically advanced war in history and a return to the most primitive form of combat. Soldiers would carry rifles, grenades, and also a homemade spiked club, just in case things got medieval. Which they did, regularly. Trench raids often devolved into brutal close-quarters fighting in the dark with whatever weapons were available, proving that no amount of modern technology eliminates the possibility of having to resort to hitting someone with a stick covered in nails. 24. The PALS battalions were Britain's brilliant idea to boost recruitment by letting men from the same town or workplace enlist together and serve in the same unit. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers could fight side by side, strengthening bonds and morale. On paper, this seemed heartwarming and motivational. In practice, it was catastrophic. When a PALS battalion took heavy casualties in battle, entire communities back home would be devastated simultaneously. Small towns would lose dozens or hundreds of young men in a single day, wiping out an entire generation of fathers, brothers, and sons from the same place. The town of Accrington lost 235 men killed in one morning at the Somme from the Accrington PALS. The town of Sheffield lost 513 men from the Sheffield City Battalion at Sarah in a few hours. Families who had encouraged their boys to enlist together were destroyed. Streets with multiple families grieving simultaneously. The policy was quietly abandoned, but not before thousands of communities across Britain experienced collective trauma that lasted generations. Recruitment strategy meets worst possible outcome. 25. Doctors initially believed that men couldn't get shell shock unless they'd been physically close to an exploding shell. The concussion from the blast was thought to cause microscopic brain damage. This meant that soldiers showing psychological symptoms without having been near an explosion were accused of faking it. Eventually, doctors realized that the constant stress, sleep deprivation, witnessing horrific deaths, and living in constant mortal danger could break anyone psychologically, blast exposure or not. But this realization came too slowly. Many men suffering from what we now know as PTSD were treated as malingerers or cowards because they hadn't been standing next to an actual explosion when they broke down. The idea that the human mind has limits to how much horror it can process apparently needed to be scientifically proven before anyone would believe soldiers who said they couldn't take it anymore. Even after doctors accepted shell shock as real, treatment options were limited and often ineffective, ranging from electric shock therapy to being told to pull yourself together. The medical establishment's understanding of psychological trauma was approximately zero, and soldiers paid the price. 26. Soldiers on both sides believed in good luck charms and superstitions with religious fervor. Carrying a certain coin, wearing a particular item, or performing specific rituals before battle became matters of life and death importance. One soldier might refuse to fight without his lucky rabbit's foot. Another needed to tap his helmet 3 times before going over the top. These beliefs weren't just comforting, they became psychological necessities. When a soldier with a reputation for luck died, it could devastate unit morale because it proved that nothing actually protected you. Some charms were genuinely bizarre: bullets that had missed a soldier previously, pictures of sweethearts, Bibles with metal covers advertised as life-saving, pieces of shrapnel that hadn't killed someone. The military couldn't officially endorse superstition, but officers learned not to interfere because soldiers needed something to believe gave them control in situations where they had none. When you're facing machine guns and artillery, and your survival is essentially random, convincing yourself that a lucky coin makes a difference is the only way some men could function. The human need to find patterns and control in chaos, even when there is none. 27. Soldiers in some sectors could hear enemy soldiers talking in the opposite trench, sometimes only 50 yards away. In quiet moments, you could hear them coughing, singing, arguing, or crying. Both sides would shout insults or jokes across no man's land. Germans would yell in broken English. British soldiers would attempt German. This created a deeply weird dynamic where you were living within earshot of men you'd try to kill tomorrow. Some soldiers reported hearing the enemy discussing the same complaints they had: terrible food, incompetent officers, wanting to go home. This made it psychologically harder to dehumanize them. Propaganda worked hard to depict the enemy as monsters, but when you can hear them complaining about their rations and missing their families every night, that narrative falls apart. Officers discouraged fraternization for this exact reason. The Christmas truce happened partly because soldiers had been listening to each other for months. High command learned that proximity breeds empathy, so they rotated units frequently to prevent soldiers from getting too familiar with the humans they were supposed to be killing. The greatest enemy of war is often recognizing the enemy as human. 28. Going over the top meant climbing out of your trench and advancing across open ground toward enemy positions. Officers would blow whistles, and men would climb ladders and charge. The psychological terror of this act is hard to overstate. You were leaving safety and stepping into a killing field with full knowledge that you'd likely die. Some men froze on the ladders. Some were shot before they cleared the parapet. Others made it a few yards before machine gun fire cut them down. The first men over were almost always casualties, because they drew fire while climbing. Yet soldiers did this repeatedly, knowing the odds. Refusing meant court-martial and potential execution. Some officers would stand behind their own men with pistols drawn to shoot anyone who wouldn't advance. The courage required is staggering, but so is the absolute insanity of the tactic. Military leadership ordered men to commit what was essentially mass suicide charge after mass suicide charge for 4 years, with minimal tactical variation, expecting different results. The definition of insanity applies remarkably well to World War I military strategy. 29. Barbed wire was everywhere, and it was far more effective at stopping attacks than anyone anticipated. German positions were often protected by wire barriers 30 feet deep and several feet high. Artillery bombardments were supposed to destroy it, but usually just tossed it around and made it worse, creating unpredictable tangles. Advancing infantry would get caught in the wire, becoming stationary targets for machine guns. Soldiers would die hanging on the wire, and their bodies couldn't be retrieved, remaining visible for months. Units attempting to cross would bunch up at gaps, creating perfect targets. Engineers tried using Bangalore torpedoes, pipes full of explosives pushed under the wire to blow gaps, but these had to be deployed under fire and frequently failed. Tank treads got tangled in wire. Some attacks failed without ever reaching enemy trenches because troops couldn't get through the wire. The simple pastoral fence material used to keep cattle contained proved to be one of the most effective defensive weapons of the war. Nobody expected that the toughest obstacle on the battlefield would be livestock fencing, yet here we are. 30. Soldiers often had to sleep standing up or sitting in muddy water because trenches were too narrow and too wet for lying down. In winter, this became torture. Frostbite, exhaustion, and hypothermia were constant threats. Some sectors, particularly in Flanders, had trenches that were essentially open sewers filled with water up to knee or waist depth. Soldiers stood in this for days during their rotation at the front. Duckboards, wooden slats, were laid down, but they were perpetually soaked and slippery. Men would fall off the boards into the filthy water, sometimes drowning in mud if they were injured or weighted down with gear. Sleeping while standing became a learned skill, with soldiers propping themselves against the trench wall or literally tying themselves in place so they wouldn't fall into the water when they dozed off. The human body isn't designed for this. Sleep deprivation became so severe that men would hallucinate. The physical breakdown from simply existing in these conditions, before any combat, left soldiers exhausted, sick, and mentally shattered. Fighting a war was secondary to just surviving the environment you were forced to live in. 31. The war ended on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m. The armistice was signed at 5 a.m. This meant everyone knew the war was ending in 6 hours. Despite this, fighting continued throughout the morning. Commanders on both sides ordered attacks right up until 11 a.m. Men died in the final hours, even the final minutes, knowing the war was about to end. Some officers wanted to capture one more objective for prestige. Some wanted to use their remaining ammunition rather than haul it back. The last soldier killed was American Henry Gunther, shot charging a German machine gun position at 10:59 a.m. The German troops, who knew the armistice was moments away, tried to wave him off, but he kept coming and they killed him. He died 1 minute before the war ended. Approximately 11,000 casualties occurred on November 11, 1918, including nearly 3,000 dead. All of them pointless. All of them avoidable. The final act of World War I was commanding soldiers to die for literally nothing, knowing the war would end in hours. If there's a more fitting conclusion to 4 years of strategic stupidity, I can't think of it. Okay, let's collectively acknowledge the sheer volume of bad decisions we just witnessed. Soldiers fighting without rifles, wearing bright red pants, charging machine guns on horseback, and dying 1 minute before peace was declared. It's honestly miraculous that humanity survived itself. So tell me, which one of these 31 facts absolutely broke your brain? Did we miss an even dumber World War I moment you've heard about? Drop it in the comments and let's build the definitive archive of historical facepalms. If this video shattered your faith in military planning, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because trust me, history is an endless goldmine of spectacular incompetence. Wars might change, but human stupidity? That's eternal.